The protected position of the hand is a terribly important component of protection of joints to prevent contracture. And the protected position is full flexion of the MPs, full extension of the IPs. And if you've got a crush injury or a burn, this is where you'd like to have those joints held. We'll sometimes, in a bad burn, for instance, run pins through the metacarpal head into the proximal phalanx to maintain this position. Makes it easy to dress, deal with the burn, and it will protect the joints. This is the neglected position. This is what happens to a hand if it's been burned or injured and not treated, not cared for, and not maintained in that intrinsic plus position. Let's look at the anatomy of the MP joint. Metacarpal, proximal phalanx. In extension, the joint is lax. It has radial and ulnar deviation. It has rotation, and it's loose. The collaterals are loose. The synovial spaces are large. The contact surface of the joint is small, and this is a very different joint than the joint in flexion. This is a very loose, free-moving joint. If we leave the proximal phalanx right there and draw the MP joint now in full flexion, so we're looking down the shaft of the metacarpal. What we've just done is turn the hand so that the proximal phalanx is the same projection as it was in extension, but now we're looking down the shaft, full flexion of the MP. And we notice that number one, the contact space is now total. The synovial space becomes very small. The collateral ligaments have to bulge out over the bony prominence that appears as flexion occurs. So as this finger goes from this position down to flexion, a condyle appears on one or both sides, and the collateral ligaments have to run out over that, which tightens them. So that when we look at the joint in full flexion, it has no rotation, it has no lateral freedom, if you will, but it's a very stable joint. This phenomena is useful when dealing with a fracture of the metacarpal, because now you've got a lock on the distal metacarpal and can control its rotational position. This means that if you immobilize the joint in this full flexion position, it very easily will go back to the free, open joint. You won't get contracture in this fully flexed position. Whereas if you leave it in extension, it doesn't want to go back to the more restricted, or goes back with great difficulty. We did some experimental work, showed about 1 millimeter of shortening of one collateral will produce about 30 degrees of lack of flexion of the joint. So it doesn't take much to restrict the motion. Not only that, if you have a hand that's been crushed and you get synovitis, the synovial fluid space fills up, and that drives this joint into extension. If I took an injected fluid into the MP joint, it would drive the joint into extension. That increases the tone on the middle joints and sets us up for the negative, flexed, contracted hand that's so hard to deal with. And that is the anatomy issues with the MP joint. You'll say the middle joints get contracted in flexion. That's why their position is a fully extended joint. And that's because the middle joints form check reins and flexion deformity of the volar plate, which is the structure that lies in the front of the middle joint. In the middle joint, that volar plate is a piece of fibrocartilage that has almost no collapsibility. It's fixed in its length and slides up and down on the front of the joint. The MP joint has a volar plate that is like the child's gate at the top of the stairs, and that has a great deal of collapsibility from its full extended position to a fully flexed position where the fibers are going across. So that the extended joint might be that length and the collapsed joint in full flexion is that length. This collapsibility of the volar plate is what lets you immobilize this joint in full flexion and not develop a flexion contracture of the MP joint.